Needs my water, thank you so much. My flight is at 12:53.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a very sensitive microphone. I'll go turn it down a bit. Okay, so thank you all so much for joining us for this event, both in person and virtually. We at Left Bank Books are so honored and excited to present a brilliant witness to history and crusader for justice, Helen Shiller, who is here to suggest her profoundly human and profoundly personal memoir, Daring to Struggle, Daring to Win, 5 Decades of Resistance in Chicago's Uptown Community. So some housekeeping before we dive in. For all of you here in person, we thank you for being here and for wearing your mask for the duration of the event. It is also our goal to provide hybrid events, both because of COVID reasons previously, but now just going forward so that we can reach a wider audience. So for those of us joining us at home, we appreciate your support, and you'll be able to ask questions during the Q&A at the end of the event, so just type in your questions as comments. So tonight's event is only possible because of your support. When you support Left Bank Books, your money goes directly into the local economy. It helps us keep our bookstore open, and it also helps keep your streets paved, your libraries funded, your parks free, and so many other things making St. Louis a better place. So thank you so much for shopping local and for supporting this event. For tonight's event, Daring to Struggle, Daring to Win tells the fascinating true story of an individual radical organizer turned independent Chicago City Council member and her 40-year struggle for justice in Chicago. Helen went from a radical anti-war activist in Wisconsin to a member of the collective of white allies of the Black Panther Party in Chicago to an elected council person who helped break the back of radicalized opposition to Harold Washington, Chicago's first Black mayor. Shiller participated when few others did in a historic fight against gentrification of a unique economically and racially mixed Chicago community on the north side. With insight into historic community organizing and political battles in Chicago from the 1970s to 2010, this book details numerous policy fights and conflicts in Chicago during this time, illuminating recurrent political themes and battles that remain relevant to this day. Daring to Struggle, Daring to Win is a compelling, insightful must-read for all those struggling for a better world today. Rosana Rodriguez Sanchez, Alderwoman of Chicago's 33rd Ward, says, Helen Shiller's work inside and out of the Chicago City Council is a model for all of those seeking to make real change in the world. From her tireless work challenging gentrification, police abuse, and homophobia, Shiller never lost sight of her roots and always puts the struggles of poor and working class people first. No matter where you live and organize, there is so much to be learned from her inspiring and courageous life story. So please join me in welcoming Helen Shiller.
Thank you. Okay. So what I'm going to do is read a little bit and then hopefully have a little bit of a conversation with Hachio Viejas, who's with me, another playwright, author, and poet, and then take whatever questions people have. So I'm going to read a couple of different pieces here. This book is really, this book was written as a lot of stories. There's a lot there's a lot of history. There's a lot of echoes. Is it stopped? Okay.
Go ahead, since we're going to follow that.
So I really wrote a lot of stories, but the stories are interconnected, and I'm going to read you 2 of them from the beginning and then from later on in the middle of the book. On a gray day, it's actually the first chapter, and it's called Beware of Fascism. On a gray day in March 1954, my father kept me home from school. On most days, he would have been at work, and my parents rarely allowed me to miss school. In my first grade classroom, I would have been at my desk, most likely daydreaming. Instead, I was sitting on the floor of my dad's study that doubled as a family's TV room. The weather was beginning to turn. It was cold outside, but our Long Island house was heated through the floor, so I felt warm and comfortable. I knew that whatever was happening on TV was important to my dad. He was a chemist, and when he worked at home, he would sit at his desk in a big blue armchair, writing formulas, none of which I ever understood, on a desk covered with matzo crumbs and stained from weak black coffee. I was rarely permitted in this room when my dad was home, so I knew something special was happening. This was the early 1950s, and the black and white TV was one of those big round boxes that sat on the floor. Like most middle-class families in those days, we had only one TV in the house. Together, we watched the first day of the Armory-McCarthy hearings before the House Un-American Activities Committee. My father told me he knew I might not understand. I might be bored. I might not even remember much of it. Except, he said, this is an important event that's happening, and when you get older, remember it. Then find out about it. While much of the country was enthralled by the apparent exposure of communists, my family's point of view, as well as countless others, those hearings were about fascism. You need to know about fascism, how to recognize it, he told me, adding, and when you see it, you must fight against it. I was 6 years old. I didn't know yet that hundreds had already been the target of this Joe McCarthy-inspired and mostly conjured fear campaign. Nor did I know that some of the most iconic actors, writers, and artists of the time had become targets. Some had testified before the subcommittees. Others had refused. Some had been blacklisted and lost their jobs, creating waves of fear and intimidation in their wake. These hearings were designed to do just that. Now, Senator McCarthy was claiming the Army, too, was rife with communists who had to be exposed. It was an experience I would remember 10 years later when the documentary film Point of Order came out, which brought the disturbing scenes from these hearings into public view. I made sure to see it. It was not, however, until my last visit with my father, 19 years after that day in his study, that I learned our family secret that had haunted my early childhood and made these hearings so personal for him. And if you want to know what that secret was, we're going to have to read the book. Okay, so I, as was mentioned, in my early 20s, I came to Chicago to be part of a group called the Intercommunal Survival Committee. We were a cadre of young white people determined to work 24/7 under the direction of the Black Panther Party to organize white people to join the Black-led struggle for liberation. And for the next decade and a half, or a decade, we were very involved in Uptown and survival in the Uptown community in Chicago. We developed many survival programs. We sold Black Panther papers. We entrenched ourselves in the community, and we organized every single day. We were also engaged in citywide coalitions and activities, many of which were focused on the city's master plan, which to us was a planning creation or planning policy to whiten the inner city and to disperse poor and working communities and to take away potential for power from them. So that was kind of the context that led up to the movement that led up to the election of Harold Washington, who was our first Black mayor in 1983, but also an extraordinarily progressive man who had a huge reach and a very large umbrella that allowed many of us to really continue to do the kind of work that had led to his election. And he was 100% behind that and wanted it and encouraged us. So it was a very exciting time. He faced a huge opposition when he was first elected in 1983. The majority of former aldermen who had been there for a while, predominantly white aldermen, were really opposed to his election and wanted to make sure he didn't get elected again. And they formed a block of 29 aldermen. There are 50 in Chicago, so it was 29 against 21, to make sure that he could not succeed. A little bit of a foreshadowing of what happened federally when Obama was elected president some years later. At any rate, Harold had an uphill battle, but he was good for it and was good for going toe-to-toe with him, and got a little bit of a break in 1986 when there were court-ordered special elections in a few wards as a result of gerrymandering of the ward boundaries when they had been drawn after the census in 1980. And the federal court agreed and ordered that there was discrimination there and ordered that there be new lines drawn in a few different wards. And the consequence of those elections was that he now had a 25-25 split in the city council. And he came to me and actually worked on me for a while. I had no intention of running for alderman. I had done that earlier, and you can read about that in the book. And I said, never again. But he pointed out to me that I could be his 26th vote, and that if he got that 26 vote, he would have 40 votes, because there are always about 15 people sitting on the fence, and they go with the winner. And if he had 26 votes, he was the winner. So knowing that I could and I had the potential, and it was a doable election to be sitting on who was part of his opposition, I agreed to run, and I did. And as well as in the book, 7 months into that my first aldermanic term and Harold's second term as mayor, he died. And so I was kind of left on my own after that, to figure out why I was there. I mean, I knew that my priority was always not just making sure that he had the support that he needed to do the transformation in the city that he always said was necessary, which he described primarily as the first step that would probably take 20 years to internalize, was to address and eliminate institutional racism and institutional corruption. So I was committed to that. But here I was having to figure out what to do with a whole phalanx of talking heads saying, oh, she can't win, she just won. I'm kind of a stubborn person, so that put me over the edge. And when I was considering whether or not to run for election, I did, and was there for another 5 terms, a total of 24 years. During that time, I had many struggles, and one of my priorities always was to prove you could do development without displacement. And Uptown was a really good place from which to engage in that struggle. And the next piece that I'm going to read is out a tent city that was set up in Uptown in my first term. And it refers at the beginning to Jane Byrne, who was the mayor for a very brief time, for 1 term, elected in 1979, with a great deal of support from the Black community and also from the sort of independent liberal community, and totally turned her back, especially on the Black community in that term, and which really was one of the reasons that there was such a groundswell for Harold to run and for Harold to win in 1983. But I reference her, so I wanted to clarify that. Okay, so this chapter is a tent city. In March 1980, Jane Byrne, who had then been mayor for just under a year, had been under pressure from hands from residents and the heart of Uptown Coalition, a group in Uptown, to resist an incessant residential fires by the firefighters' strike that was happening that year. In response, Byrne urged the authority to purchase property in Uptown, but not before exacting political pressure. With the race between Richard and Daley and Ed Spot on the ballot state's attorney, Byrne had offered to have the CHA buy land for housing in exchange for some number of signatures on petitions for one of the men running. We viewed elections as survival programs, and we didn't have a horse in the state's attorney's race. Both candidates were the same as far as we were concerned, so we said sure. CHA had subsequently purchased adjacent vacant 50-foot lots on the 4400 block of Malden to build scattered site housing. The lots, which had previously been the home of at least 18 large families living in 3 flats, happened to be next door to where I lived. At the time, the CHA's scattered site program had been in receivership, meaning the Habitat Company, as the receiver, had been tasked with the responsibility of getting scattered site housing built. On Malden, they put up a fancy wrought iron fence and let it sit for years. In October 1988, just as the weather was turning, a coalition of affordable housing organizations and activists, including the Chicago Area Union for the Homeless, the 46 Ward Fair Share Organization, and the Jesus People USA, organized a tent city on this land demanding action. From their perspective, this was an ideal location for such a project. It was public land, it was designated to provide housing for low-income people, it was safe because it could be secured, the fence had a gate, and the homeless people staying there bought a lock and chain with them, giving them the ability to control access. For 6 days and nights, up to 75 men and women and a handful of children stayed in homemade tents and shanties, forming their own community and protecting each other. The majority of them went to work during the day, most often as day laborers, while those school-aged children went to school. For the most part, so they felt safe, and held impromptu meetings and musical jam sessions with their supporters. The media came to tell their story. In response, many people stopped by bringing food, blankets, and clothing. Many neighborhood residents came and showed their support as well. Some of my neighbors across the street, however, were not happy. After a few days, their complaints to me, to CHA, the Chicago Housing Authority, and to the receiver began to mount. One person told me, "Don't I have the right to be able to go outside and not see people camped out in front of my house?" They were not pleased with my response. That the rights of people to have decent, safe, affordable housing trumped the small amount of discomfort that came from having to see the homeless literally from their front window. After all, everyone staying in Tent City would have preferred to be housed in a warm and safe apartment. 5 days into their stay and after 2 major rainstorms, I received notice from Habitat point person Phil Hickman that the Tent City residents would be evicted the next day. Everyone got together to decide what to do. The Jesus people who lived nearby and often provided shelter to homeless people agreed to take the remaining food and clothing that had been donated for safekeeping. Representatives were then chosen to join me the next day and refused to leave, challenging Habitat to have us arrested for trespassing. The charges, we hoped, would lead to a jury trial where we could put the city's low-income housing crisis before the court, along with its denial and neglect of its homeless population. That evening, I attended a meeting convened by gay and lesbian community leaders decrying a series of hate crimes in Lakeview. I bumped into David Scondras. Our paths had crossed before, and I knew David, an openly gay alderman from Boston, to be an unapologetic advocate for affordable housing. We spoke briefly about the evening's agenda, and I shared with him my intentions to take a stand the following day when it was time for the eviction. He offered to join us. In the morning, he joined me, Jerry Miglietta representing the 46th Ward Fair Share Organization, John Trott representing the Jesus People, and Vinnie Strickland representing the Coalition for the Homeless. The first thing that morning, all the food and everyone's belongings were packed up and moved. At the designated time, a phalanx of police, decked out in dress uniform, walked down the street until they got to the gate at the front of the property where they cut the lock and entered. Phil Hickman read an order for everyone to leave or face arrest for trespassing. After a few brief statements, the 4 of us remained, and we were carted away by 2 separate paddy wagons, one for the women and one for the men. We never got our trial. All the charges were ultimately dropped. A few years later, 17 families moved into their new scattered site townhomes on the lot. So that was my reading, but there is, it occurred to me, one last thing I wanted to do, really, James, in your honor, actually, or just to make full circle, because one of the things that was a constant throughout my years organizing and then as a city council member was the method of work that I had learned in theory and practice of the Black Panther Party. And so at the very back of the book, I want to read what I wrote at the back of the book. My activism in the early years was animated and guided by the 10-point platform, by the Black Panther Party's 10-point program. And as I've written this book, I realize how much my governance as an elected official in the decades after that as well. Points 4, 5, and 7 became 3 of my most consistent fights. In many ways, the program and platform of the Black Panther Party was simply a demand that the promises and ideals of democracy and justice promised to white men who owned property when our country was founded simply be finally applied to Black folk. There's nothing really radical about that, or maybe there still is. Originally written by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale in 1966, the platform and program was revised in March 1972 and is reprinted below. The revised version acknowledged the role of technology, made the language gender inclusive, and expanded it to include all oppressed people and communities. It served us well in Uptown, where we were committed to organizing poor and working whites to join the Black-led struggle for liberation. After all, we all face so many common problems. The Black Panther Party platform and program now included them. The racism we encountered was wedded to the white skin privilege many held onto, and it was an ongoing and primary barrier. Our best tool was a vision of future changes worth fighting for anyone willing and able to break the yoke of racism and white skin privilege.
Maybe we could just sit here. Okay, let's both sit there. Just working. Maybe we have to push this button.
Oh, very good. All right.
Okay. Is it working now?
Yes.
All right, great.
So theoretically.
Theoretically. All right.
So let's back up to the very first piece that you read, where you were talking about your dad encouraging you to, really watch these hearings, which he knew were historic, he knew were important and impactful. What kind of activism were your parents involved in? What kind of political engagement did they have?
So I actually spent some time talking about their history in the book. My parents were both immigrants, and both of them came actually in 1921, I think, 20 or 21, but they came separately. My father came from Lafayette, and he was just 12. He came alone. He had to pretend to be 16, and he was pretty much self-taught when he got here. Ended up teaching in WPA, actually in the New York University. And my mother came when she was 6.5, the same year, with her whole family, and at least those that were already born. And they both ended up in the Bronx. My mother became a nurse, and by the I guess during the Depression, they were both actively engaged in, I think probably both at that time joined the Communist Party, but they were engaged in lots of left-wing activities. And my mother always had a thing about culture, and was always going to what we would call coffees today. Mm-hmm. And they were always, and they were the drawing for progressive artists from all over actually all over the Americas. So she would be at coffees and meet with, and evidence of it was in her house with Paul Robeson, with Diego Rivera, with Alice Neal, and Alice and she became very good friends, and she kept up relationships with a lot of folks. So that was a big influence for her, but also, just in terms of the conversation in the family. My dad after he left, his story is a longer story, and I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but essentially he came here alone when he was 12. He was sent by his parents, who he had basically been supporting his family by selling things from his father's tailor shop on the street during the period of World War I. And when he was very young, obviously. And when his father returned, around the time his father got back to the country, because he had been unable to get into the occupied territory during the war, he received a ticket of transit to come to the States. And he had just gotten home. So they decided to reward my dad by sending him, although he took it as a criticism of that he had done a poor job. Mm. So he left feeling like he had not lived up to their expectations in a time when there was no way to really communicate except in writing. He didn't write. And they apparently, I don't think they even knew how to reach him. And it wasn't until the late 30s, when after Hitler took over in Germany, that he started to really worry about what was happening. And after the war, after the U.S. got in the war, he tried to join the army, and they rejected him because they said he was too old, because they went by his legal age. Mm-hmm. So at that point, he was a chemist, and he decided he couldn't work for any of the chemical companies because they were all involved. He was sure that every one of them was involved with Nazi Germany, and was even though the U.S. government was not acknowledging what was happening in Germany, in the Jewish community, it was pretty well known and believed. Yeah, and so they knew that people were that the chemicals were being used, gas was being used to kill people, and he was quite sure that was done in collusion with almost any company that he might have an opportunity to work with. So he started his own business. So they were, they were involved in mostly communist activities during that time, but not that much. They were in a cell. My dad loved to argue. He got kicked out. And my mother just kept going, as far as I could tell. And they went about their business over time, and were involved and interested in, sort of outliers when it came to education and other stuff. Sent my brothers away to school and then ultimately me. And reading was a very important part of our house. My mother really loved Howard Fast. I think he probably had come to some of their coffees. She had his books in the house, and we had a little bit of a scare, which is the piece you're going to have to read about in the book. But at that point, my mother got rid of all of her books, except for just one or two, and one of them was Howard Fast's book on Reconstruction called Freedom Road, and it was the first chapter book I read, and it infuriated me. It was after the fascism thing with my dad, because obviously I was a little older then. But it stuck with me. That was for me it just was the essence of what was wrong. And an opportunity to really finally make, really change the dynamic in the country and how it's completely, the amount of corruption and racism and how it's completely turned around. Never left my mind. So that was, it's sort of the history.
So you trot off to college, you trot off to Wisconsin, to Madison, and you get really radicalized there, right?
Well, my dad is really upset because I'm not involved enough, so he keeps pushing me to do stuff. So I get involved in the war movement, and then in the Black student strike demanding African American studies, and also end up in a trip to Cuba, a student trip to Cuba, and that ended up being quite long, and then got recruited to go to Racine, Wisconsin, to organize, to basically put my mouth where my feet where my mouth was, I guess you'd say. There was no money involved, and to organize. And there were students who were doing that in several cities, and so a group of us went to different places and went to Racine.
So I know that while you were in Racine, you were involved in a bunch of different, very hands-on activities, and then that propelled you to Chicago. But in Chicago, things took a very different turn because you ended up getting involved, very deeply involved in electoral politics. I mean, Chicago sort of functions at this very neighborhood.
Let me go back a second because I forgot a piece. So in Madison, somewhere in the middle between the different events that were going on, in 1968, Fred Hampton comes to Chicago to Madison to speak to students, and that's really where and that was really the turning point for me. It was before the Black student strike, but it was totally the turning point for me, and it's really from that interaction that I decided to name the book "Daring to Struggle, Daring to Win," because for me, Fred always said. Well, he said a lot of things, but one of the things that he always said was over and over again was dare to struggle, dare to win. If you don't dare to struggle, you don't deserve to win. And that for me was a mantra. It was really important. And it was kind of how I held myself accountable my entire adult life. If I really got discouraged, and then I'd look at the world and see that really what I wanted wasn't there yet, that was what I had to do. So that was really impactful, and that followed through because in Racine, we not only, we really were already following the 10-point platform program. We took families to visit their loved ones in state prisons. We had a breakfast program. We had some health programs. We did welfare and legal defense. We did a bunch of stuff there, and then got recruited from people in Chicago to come to Chicago and join what was being formed.
Who recruited you in Chicago?
So it was Slim Coleman and Kathy Archibald had been part of it in SDS, and we knew them.
NSCS?
SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, and we knew them from there. They were in Chicago, we were in Racine, and from occasionally we talked. When Fred was killed, the night that Fred was killed, the night before Fred was killed, Mark and I, who was my partner, were talking about maybe we were going to leave Racine. We had just had a huge fight, and we were going to split up. We woke up in the morning hearing that Fred had been killed, and we said, no, we have to recommit ourselves. So we did, and we went back to Racine, and we started doing a lot more programs. But we connected then with Slim and Kathy because we needed, just before Fred died, he had, there was a group in Milwaukee that was not yet a chapter, waiting to be a chapter. But Fred had disbanded everybody temporarily just before he died. So they didn't have any kind of official thing, and we couldn't get papers from them anymore. We had been doing a newsletter. They did a newsletter that we printed for them. We laid out and printed for them, and they gave us paper. And we bought papers from them, and we'd sell them. But after Fred died, we had to do something else. So we actually went to the funeral, asked Slim and Kathy to connect us with someone. They connected us with the Rockford chapter of the Black Panther Party, and they started doing political education with us and providing us with the Black Panther papers that we sold regularly. So that was all happening before. And then Slim Coleman and Bobby Rush, who was then the Deputy Minister of Defense of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party, decided.
I'm fascinated by the fact that there were all these Black Panther, connections all over and a geographical area that I think of, outside of Chicago, as relatively white.
Yeah. So, yeah, well, there were also anything actually here. Anyways, because we were then, so they had this idea of forming the Intercommunal Survival Committee. It was approved in Oakland, and that was going to be white people working under the direction of the Black Panther Party among white people. And we were recruited from Racine and a group of people that were down here in St. Louis, working with the East St. Louis chapter of the Black Panther Party.
Southern Illinois.
Yeah, Southern Illinois. Right.
Yeah.
And so we all were, so we got recruited. That's how we got to Chicago.
All right, so you come to Chicago, you're doing your thing, you're working in this very diverse, very at that time sort of Wild West kind of town, or district or area, neighborhood. Uptown was sort of going through a lot of changes. There was a lot of economic interests, a lot of racial interests, a lot of political interests happening in Uptown. And suddenly you are asked, long before Harold asked you to run for alderman, you're asked to be the flag bearer for an electoral campaign. And never in your life had you imagined yourself doing that. And, let's be frank, you weren't, you weren't what a lot of people would have imagined as a political candidate. You're soft-spoken, you're, a woman. There were very few women in the city council at that time.
There had only been two previous.
That's right.
Previous to that time.
Yeah, previous to that time. I think it was, Anna Langford and somebody else. Yeah. So, and you said yes.
Okay, so what happened was that we were involved in all sorts of stuff, and
All sorts of stuff.
and you couldn't be in Chicago involved in anything without coming up against the Democratic machine. So we had to deal with political stuff, and we were always fighting the aldermen around and the city around housing issues. Well, around everything, housing, healthcare, whatever. There's lots of stories about all that. Trash cans. And police misconduct, high on the list. At any rate, the alderman resigned, and all of a sudden there was going to be a special election. So we wanted to jump into it. I was it because I was a woman, I was Jewish, and the way that the board was drawn was it was drawn with
Basically a huge swath of Jewish voters.
Right. So basically, there was the heart of Uptown was poor people, poor and working people. Surrounding it, especially on the lakefront, was wealthier and predominantly white people. And on the lakefront, there were 10,000 Jewish voters registered to vote in 46th Ward, and they voted. So that they really made a decision about what's happening. So we felt we had to have someone Jewish. So it was me. I was a woman. I was Jewish.
So why was being
and
a woman?
I had a Bachelor of Arts degree.
Okay. Wait, but why was being a woman a positive at a time when there were only 2 women in the city council?
Because it was a lakefront liberal ward along the lakefront. So being a woman was a plus, and being Jewish was a plus. We didn't expect them to turn me into the wrong kind of Jew in terms of their campaigning,
Right.
but we weren't surprised, and that would happen again later on. But at any rate, that was why I was chosen. So I was very shy, and actually I have to tell you that. So I couldn't really. I said yes, but I was like, oh my God. So there was a forum in the local city college, and then I had to go to the first thing I had to go to that was public besides our announcement. And I get up to the podium I start to walk up to the podium and I'm like 6 feet away from it, or maybe 4 feet away from it, and I just freeze. I literally was terrified. And Slim comes up behind me, he puts his hand on my back and just pushes me into the microphone. I don't want to get out of nowhere. And I just had to start talking. And that was kind of like the rest of my life. Just, feet first, just jump in.
And there you were, and you weren't successful.
No, we did terrible in the special election, but the special election was held in either April or May of 1978. In February of 1979, with the regularly scheduled municipal elections, and with the runoff, if necessary, being scheduled for that April, I ended up being in all of those elections, and we ended up losing by just barely 200 votes. And afterwards, over the course of the next couple of years, as we became more organized and got deeper into the community, some of the Democratic precinct captains and people that had worked for them turned to our side and began to tell us how it turned out to be about 2,500 votes had been stolen from us. So once we knew that, we were able to protect our elections much better. And that's really the reason I was able to win after that.
I'm glad it got resolved. I'm glad they got resolved.
Well, they're still doing it sometimes, but I knew what the tactics were.
The Democrats.
So it was hard for them to continue to do, well, that people do that in power no matter who they are, right?
They're terrible.
Yeah.
They're
Had
terrible.
to keep your.
So the Chicago machine was Democratic in name, but its policies were
No, it
always
was
so
Democratic
conservative and
political
reactionary.
policy. Yes, because the Democratic Party is reactionary. If you want the black perspective.
Right.
Now, maybe for liberal whites, it's not the same. But we know the Black Panther Party started based on police brutality.
Right.
It was the Black Panther Party for self-defense. That was the original name.
That's right.
That's right.
Self-defense against what?
Right.
Right. And what we seeing now, because of videos, all this, because of the internet, you see daily what the police forces do.
Right.
We were telling people that back in the 60s and nobody would believe us.
Right.
Oh, you must have did something wrong. Did you not talk to the guy right? What did you say? Didn't show your ID on time? No.
Right.
We knew all that was crap.
So what's clear to me is that, and clear in Chicago today, actually, is that the tactic really is just to always blame the victim. And then once you do that, you can do whatever you want.
Well, that's always been the case. The thing is now we got cameras on the cops. We got people with these iPhones and whatever. Now you can see, people are starting to see, well, have they always been like that? Yeah, the black community been telling you this for 50 years. I'm 75 years old, and they were doing that back then.
Sure. And that was, it was not only the basis of the formation of the Black Panther Party, but it was constantly for us one of the key elements that provided for unity among people in different communities, because that was something we all had in common.
Sure.
Yeah.
They're thugs. They always have been.
I want to leave room for any questions from folks, but I wanted to ask you this one thing, okay? When you came into the city council, you came in a historic election, because you came in with Harold Washington and a time of tremendous drama in the city. I mean, I remember that the election of Harold Washington was news, like, in Caracas, it was news. It was not just local Chicago
Worldwide,
news.
yeah.
And the particular way that he had been elected through all of I remember, people throwing stuff at him and campaign, which was repeated in '87, even though nobody thinks about that, everybody So you came in as a witness to history from day one. And you hung in there for 24 years, far exceeding Harold's administration. You were there through the entire, mess. What do you think of as a real success, something that really gives you hope?
Well, I guess the low point really was when Harold died, because it felt like so much hope had been dashed.
Oh, it was
I-
a terrible, also a
it
very
was-
terrible, violent night, and just crazy.
It was. I truly believe that anything is possible. It's just a matter of figuring out there's a solution to every problem. It's just about figuring out what it is. And just because you don't know at a moment doesn't mean it's not there. And I have a lot of, during this, I about the Democratic and the Republican Party. But what I do think is that there's a difference between what is happening today, just because what's happening, this movement to go back to the original Constitution, to the state of things in this country where the only people who had rights were people who were wealthy white men, is very dangerous. And the fact that that is now represented in the Supreme Court, to me, is very serious and is an example of fascism. So to me, the current state of things in elections is about about just being defensive, in order to be able to give us the time to make real changes and to get deeper. My experience in the city council was that, and before then, but I had to live with it in the city council, was that the tendency of politicians, most elected officials, and Harold and I used to argue about this, but that's because he wasn't like this. He used to love being a politician, and I'm like, I hate politics, and we'd have this conversation, which is that for most elected officials, they will tell you only what they think they have to tell you, promise you what they have to promise you in order to be able to get whatever they want. And when it comes to issues that are really important, that means once you're in office, that and we don't get solutions. So for me, it was really important to show you could do stuff different and demand real solutions to problems. And I think that you have to really, you can't solve a problem unless you look at the most serious manifestation of it, and that you identify people who are most affected by that manifestation, and you start there. That you keep in mind that just because at the heart of it somebody is affected or a group of people is affected and you have to solve that you also have to make sure your solution doesn't have a negative impact as you get broader out. And I did that. I mean, I really believe that, and I did it, and I had to find ways to do it. And often in doing that, you allow for your opposition to be very vocal, but it's worth it if you can come to a solution. And nothing comes easy, so that when people come up with easy answers and people demand easy answers, you can't just give it to them because they want to. You actually have to have a conversation. You have to engage people in understanding what you're doing. You have to communicate, but you have to involve them. It's just like the survival programs. We were not do-gooders who were doing stuff for people. We were creating activities that were based on the needs that people had that allowed them to survive pending revolution, but in order to be able to be involved enough to make the change ultimately that we needed to make, but to be able to survive while we were doing it. And in the course of things, it changed all sorts of institutions in the country. We lose track of that, we lose that edge, and we have to be reminded, I think. So I think we're in a defensive position. We may disagree, but I think we're in a defensive position, and it's okay, we can disagree. And I think it's really important that we are very vigilant when it comes to fascism.
Liberals might be in a defensive position, but the Black community is not.
Well, I think the Black community.
No, we're not.
So
You're not
the Black
listening to
Panther
Black
Party, the
media.
self-defense.
You're not listening to Black media. I agree. I guarantee you, you're not. We're not in the defensive. We're on the offensive.
No, I'm not disagreeing with that, but the offense is being defensive at this point in time. So I don't mean by the defensive, I mean it in the same
Self-defense
way.
is always at the bottom, because anytime that Black people in this country, and this is historical fact, have moved to try to uplift themselves, they've always been, I mean, we can talk about Black Wall Street and all that kind of stuff, but that was only one of over 200 communities that were destroyed. Black communities had their own systems and all that. So we know there's going to be resistance. Martin Luther King started resistance. There's always going to be, is always historic.
I agree with that.
Every time Black people have tried to deal with their self-interest, there's always a backlash from the system, regardless if Republicans are in or Democrats is in.
Absolutely.
You know, we keep forgetting that Biden was the author of the
I haven't forgotten.
of the crime bill, okay? And he bragged about it. And see, now we can go to YouTube and we can see this stuff that people couldn't see back then. When he talked about call the people, him and Hillary called the people called young Black youth as beast and all this kind, and they can't be. What did Biden say? They might have had problems with the system, but we can't deal with that. We got to lock them up. We got to, you know, that's what Biden was saying.
So I'm not, I know that's true. My point, I think, is this, that it is, if we are gonna be effective at changing the world in which we live in, then we need to be cognizant of the political powers that be in order to be able to change what they're doing or redefine what that is.
Truth is the only way we're going to.
That is right, and that requires it requires organizing, it requires communication, it requires building a seed. So, and that's my point, is that I wanted to make, is that if we're successful in everywhere in building a sea that forces, that creates a sea in which to swim, that in order to be able to force that wave to make that change, we will be able to do that. I think that that's really an important vehicle. And when I was alderman, I have to tell you that I was most effective in challenging the way things were and getting a change in the direction when there was a real sea for me to swim in and where people were really out there doing that. So I think it's really important.
You gotta have a community.
You have to.
A politician is worthless without the community backing.
You have to.
Whether they're reactionary or whatever.
That's right.
That politician needs that community.
That's right.
Other than that, they're not gonna be effective in anything.
That's right.
Are there any questions from the online people?
Not right now. Did you have one you wanted to ask?
I was gonna say something earlier. I think she was saying something about change and everything like that. I wanted to say something real important.
Did not
I
mean
didn't
to
want
put
to
you on the
interrupt
spot.
her. I didn't want to interrupt her while she was trying to give her 2 cents and everything.
You can always interrupt me.
But yeah, I think it's good that you're engaging with the community, making those attempts to try to make those changes, activities that people can get involved in. You just got to find out what the people's interests are, because they're going to let you know right away. They're not going to lie to you. They're going to implicitly let you know
Yeah,
what changes need to be made, because they've seen the opposite and they don't like it.
right.
And they have a solution for it because they see that gap that hasn't been
Yeah.
filled yet. So that's where I come in.
Yeah.
I'm here to fill in those gaps. Something that hasn't been talked about has to be talked about. It has to be filled. That gap has to be filled, or else people will be blinded for so long, and the process is just going to keep going and going and going and going and going. More positive changes means that we need to fill in those gaps. People need to talk about it instead of leaving it in the dark, because that's what real problems in life.
Yeah,
Just want to add.
yeah, no, yeah, really important.
Go on, brother. Keep on.
It's the truth.
Yeah,
And I stand on it.
good. I agree with that. I stand on it too. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. I
Thank
think
you.
we're good.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rowan.
Yeah.